Hello, everybody. Hope you guys are well. I'm coming to you guys again with another book introduction and I would say recommendation at this point. It's a book that just came out and was recently published maybe a couple of weeks ago when I received it, and I've already read through the majority of it, and it's entitled Lacanian Psychoanalysis and Eastern Orthodox Christian Anthropology in Dialogue. And it is the first material that I've come across that piques the interest of someone with strange proclivities as myself. So I have a background of studying psychoanalysis and philosophy, and I'm deeply entrenched in Orthodox patristic thought and Orthodox Christianity. And to see a book come out that is exploring the resonances, convergences, and also the divergences of something like such an esoteric yet influential system as Jacques Lacan's psychoanalysis. Jacques Lacan was a French psychoanalyst that was writing after Freud, and his work is very esoteric and complicated to engage with. At least initially, it takes some time to really enter into the logic, but I think the insights in there are brilliant, and I've had a lot of intimations of how a lot of the insights, obviously in a very different way that Lacan was pointing to and just psychoanalysis as a whole, were answered or like appropriately mediated by, Eastern Orthodox metaphysics or theology and even anthropology. So to see a work come out, it's done by Dr. Carl Waits, who's and Teresa Clement Tisdale. Both of them are practicing psychoanalysts, and they wrote this book here just recently, and I'm impressed by the overall thrust of the book and its succinct and consistent way of introducing and covering in a broad way very complicated and complex systems of thought as Lacanian psychoanalysis and Eastern Orthodox Christian anthropology are. So I'm going to introduce I'm going to read through some of the table of contents for you guys, then I'm going to read one of the chapters, and I think you'll see what I'm getting at here. I'll see if I can give you a broad overview of how the book is structured here. So the book, in a gist, it says this book vigorously engages Lacan with a spiritual tradition that has yet to be thoroughly addressed within psychoanalytic literature, the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition. The book offers a unique engagement with the faith system that highlights and extends analytic thinking. For those in formation within the Orthodox tradition, this book brings psychoanalytic insights to bear on matters of faith that may at times seem opaque or difficult to understand. Ultimately, the authors seek to elicit in the reader the reflective and contemplative posture of orthodoxy, as well as the listening ear of analysis while considering the human subject. This work is relevant and important for those training in psychoanalysis and Orthodox theology or ministry, as well as for those interested in the intersection between psychoanalysis and religion. And I would fall in that latter camp there. So the table of contents, the way that the book is structured: Part 1, it has an introduction. Part 2 is Lacanian Psychoanalysis and Overview. And if you're familiar with Lacan, that's a hell of a task to give an overview of his systemic work. Chapter 3 is Eastern Orthodox Christian Theology and Overview, another Herculean task that I think is done really, really well. An overview of Eastern Orthodox Christian Theology. And then chapter 4 in Part 1 is Lacanian Psychoanalysis and Christianity, where he reviews the literature in the last 30 years of the engagement of Lacanian psychoanalysis with Christianity. And the vast majority, if not all of the literature out there, has to do with Lacanian psychoanalysis in light of a kind of Western Christian tradition, and read through that lens, when I think there's just a huge impasses there where it doesn't really make sense to compare the two. But I think when you bring it to the Eastern Orthodox perspective, there are a lot of fruitful resonances that I think can enrich even one's Orthodox faith. Well, of course, Lacan was an atheist and kind of I don't know about militaristic atheist, but he was definitely an atheist who criticized religion as such. And I think a lot of his criticisms are fair, but I think they are they are answered quite beautifully, deeply by, the Orthodox Christian ethos. Part 2 is entitled, Part 2 has these sections here: Oedipus at Eden, God in Analysis, Jouissance in the Body of the Church, the Ethics of Orthodoxy, Ego and Ego Fate, and then concluding Reflections. And I'm going to read from chapter 8, the Ethics of Orthodoxy, just to give you a little bit of a flavor here. So the broad overview of Lacan has to do with his general conceptual frameworks. So he says here, with anthropology as the focal point of our work, exploring a Lacanian conception of the human person is critical. And much of this overview focuses on Lacanian understanding of the subject. The order in which these ideas are presented is intended to ease the reader into more complex ideas. Conveniently, this is all what roughly follows something of a chronology in the development of Lacanian psychoanalysis. First, the Lacanian conception of the self is discussed. Right, and this is the driving impetus for at least myself, is exploring different historical conceptualizations of what it means to be a person. What is a self? What is a subject? That's been really heavily psychologized, obviously, in the 20th century. But there are several conceptualizations of what is the self, whether it's Heidegger or Freud and Lacan. I think it's interesting to juxtapose that to the Orthodox understanding here. So first is it talks about Lacanian conception of the self. Second, the three registers. So the kind of main thrust of Lacan's work happens in these three registers, and this is a lot of times reflected as a kind of Gordian knot, where the subject is centered in the overlap between these three registers, and those are the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. And then third, it says here, Lacan's distinction of need, demand, desire, and drive is addressed. This is followed forth by the Freudian unconscious, and fifth, consideration of subjective structure. More complex topics include sexuation and narcissism will be introduced in the context of later chapters. So before we get reading here, chapter 8, it's important to understand kind of at least the main thrust of what's being get at here when we talk about human subjectivity. The idea is that what is it at the center of the human conscious, unconscious, and that which makes humans humans? What is that is kind of central to having a psyche and being in a world? And Lacan, following Freud, diverges a lot with Freud, but obviously he's responding to Freud, posits a fundamental lack at the center of the subjectivity, right? There is a lack that through engaging in civilization and culture, through engaging with signifiers, language especially, and the unconscious, we put forth tools, we put forth systems to overcome this inherent lack at the center of our consciousness. And what Lacan does is he kind of explicates a system over a decade or more of thinking through what this looks like. And he has this concept entitled the small object A, or he calls it the object cause of desire. So the thing that we desire is not inherently found in the things we desire. So if you desire a sports car, it's not intrinsically in the sports car what you desire, right? It's the desire of the other. It's other people's desire that's invested in that object that makes it desirable. But the difficulty is, and I think a lot of people have faced this, when you've reached your, long held goal, and we're satiated for maybe 5 minutes or a very short period of time, and then that fundamental lack, crept back in again, right? It's like a drug addict. When he gets his high, it's only there, it's temporary. When that high goes away, there's that fundamental lack there. Like we're taught in this society that you need to gain wealth and status, and reputation. But a lot of times once that happens, you see a crumbling of the subject, of the person. And this is, I think, best reflected in the concept of the midlife crisis, right? You have someone that's in, let's say, their mid-50s. They've got the house, they've got the car, they've got the job, they've got the bank account, the 401k. And then they realize that that fundamental lack at the center of their being is still there. And in realizing that, they could be kind of go one of two ways, right? It could be a destructive force that, causes that person to get a divorce, to, find a new young girlfriend, to buy a new red sports car, right? And continue the process of trying to satiate an unsatiable desire, right? Which is what is human civilization in a sense, in a kind of negative sense. And I think Orthodoxy has the answer to this fundamental lack, this idea of a fundamental lack at the center of human consciousness, right? And I think it's a lack of, Lacan calls it, fundamental alienation that we have as selves. We're not familiar and connected with ourselves because at the center is this vacuum, this void, this abyss that we're constantly trying to fill. It's like an attractor, right? Constantly trying to fill with new ideas, new concepts, new things, new purchases, whatever it may be. So that's a kind of a broad overview because I'm going to be trying to work through some terms here. This is a later chapter in the book. So he develops some of these terms earlier on. So I'll see if I can give a broad overview when we come across them, as we read through this. All right. So the ethics of orthodoxy. Given the central absence of the thing, and the term thing here is capitalized, and it's a concept from Lacan. That's kind of complicated to explain, but the thing is located in the register of the real, right? Which, so the real is kind of reality. The symbolic is the symbolic world that we live in, where you function through signifiers and meaning, in a sense. And the things that we cannot make meaning out of that happen in our life and that happen to us throughout our life, he calls, a lot of times he says, it's the rupture of the real into the symbolic. It's something that we can't symbolize, something that we can't conceptualize. A good way to understand this is if as a child goes through some traumatic event, whether it's a divorce or is abused or whatever it may be, what's happening to that child cannot be conceptualized in his or her framework of meaning. And this is the incursion of the real, of reality, into the symbolic, which causes trauma in a sense. So he says, given the central absence of the thing, the revelation of the thing's word in the incarnation, and the relation of the orthodox to the other jouissance, where are things left for the ethics of the church? Jouissance, in his book on morality in the Orthodox Church, sharply distinguished between the orthodox vision of morality and the stereotypical view of Western conceptions of morality. Among the most important elements of Jouissance's thought, the concepts of good and evil are not invested as they often are in the West, as proper or improper actions or as utile outcomes. Rather, quote, in the language of the text of Genesis, the distinction between good and evil refers to life and death, not to categories of behavior, not to regulative moral rules, not to faithfully keeping or breaking some law, close quote. Good and evil are nothing more than, quote, life without limit and existential finitude and death, respectively. As such, good and evil have no ontological contents. They are experiential, and the knowledge of them, the knowledge of good and evil, is an existential experience. Jouissance most clearly summarized this when arguing, quote, the morality of the gospel relates to a real, existential transfiguration of man's nature, and not simply to a more complete deontology or law which leaves human nature existentially unchanged, close quote. In other words, the mode of existence of the person, as person, must be relational, and it is transfiguration in this relation that comprises morality. There is no law in morality. Morality for the Orthodox could never be a set of rules, nor the ordering of goods. For Jouissance, the mode of relational engagement, quote, requires the ascetic self-transcendence of individuality and the reality of personal relationship and self-offering, close quote. It is through ascetic kenosis that the Orthodox pursue synergia, synergy, first with God and then also with one another. Jouissance contrasted this form of asceticism with, quote, holistic systems of individualistic utilitarianism and their totalitarian mechanisms, close quote, which are never truly threatened by supposed revolutions that operate within the same system. This includes, for Jouissance, the capitalist Marxist polarization. This includes, for Jouissance, the, quote, capitalist Marxist polarization, end quote, as orthodoxy rejects any system that restricts the good of humanity to commodities and consumer goods. Jouissance centered the, quote, existential action of the Christian in, quote, achieving the personal truth of man, that is, the human hypostasis, in relationship rather than any impoverished concepts of individuality, education, or society. The Christian, then, is to, quote, renounce the service of goods, close quote. This might be, quote, private goods, family goods, domestic goods, other goods that solicit us, the goods of our trade, of our profession, the goods of a city, etc., close quote. In abandoning utilitarianism, the Christian abandons also utility as the good altogether. The ethics of orthodoxy is the ethics of the martyrs, who, quote, embody the truth of the church, the truth of the true life, which is communion and relationship with God, by realizing a mode of existence which is the complete antithesis of individual survival and has its historical prototype in the cross of Christ, close quote. The meaning of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is that the individualistic mode of being, which is chosen by Adam and Eve, is precisely what introduces the experiential category of evil as finitude and death. It is not that a connaissance is delivered to the nous through the consumption of the fruit. The knowledge in question is the savior fare of death. This is the Christian inversion of the will to live. Those who would perpetuate their individual existence accede to death, while those who seek something beyond individual existence, i.e., who assume the place of death with respect to individuality, accede to life. Thus, while the first Adam sought from the first tree the divine essence that resulted in death, it is the second Adam who, taking up the second tree, assumed the place of death and instituted in himself the true union of the divine and human natures through the energies of God. It is the Christian commitment to the beyond of individual existence that orients all aspects of Christian life. In analytic terms, deontology, the following of the law, and utilitarianism are moralities that see only the level of the Vorstellungen, that operate according to the logic of what is good for the human as an individual or a collection of individuals. This is the pleasure principle written into theology. Lacan reads in Kant the distinction between well-being, wohl, and good, gut, differentiated by the subject's orientation to das Ding, which is the thing, on the horizon. Well-being, regulating the distance from das Ding through the pleasure principle, and the gut das Ding as resting beyond this. Setting aside the question of Kant, Lacan's proposed ethical orientation is towards the good. The beyond of the pleasure principle, that is, toward the act of the subject according to the subject's desire. Lacan's proposed ethical orientation towards the good, the beyond of the pleasure principle, Lacan contrasts this with, quote, the service of goods, close quote, at the level of the wohl, at the level of well-being, with a submission to which is a sacrifice. Lacan connects this sacrifice to that which underlies civilization and its discontents. And Lacan suggests that it is the sacrifice jouissance that, quote, religion undertakes to recuperate. So the term jouissance is one of the most famous terms in Lacan, and he left it untranslated. And the term jouissance essentially means joy, or kind of a overflow of joy. And it's also associated with anxiety and pain, right? It's this temporary overflowing of joy that temporarily alleviates but causes more suffering. It's kind of this double-edged sword. A lot of times it's correlated to the orgasm, and just this, of attaining something, but in that attainment is it's being let down in a sense. I think it has a lot to do with what we discussed a little bit earlier about this way desire works in human beings, and how attaining one's goal is often, kind of has a disintegrating force, no matter how joyful it seems in the first place. So he says, Lacan suggests that it is the sacrifice jouissance that religion undertakes to recuperate, leading Lacan to make the sort of sweeping statement he at other times condemns, stating that the effort to recuperate the lost jouissance is, quote, the single trait which is common to all religions. It is coextensive with all religion, with the whole meaning of religion. This evaluation is open to reconsideration in light of Lacan's later writings, and is taken up in the discussion of jouissance in chapter 7 of this volume, particularly related to a phallic jouissance and an other jouissance. Cataphatic religion that seeks to encapsulate God within the bounds of the symbolic and imaginary limitations of the human mind is the religion that is known for keeping its distance from das Ding. Remember, das Ding is the thing, the real, the thing that cannot be incorporated, understood, or made a map of meaning out of. It is that real which cannot be symbolized. It is no coincidence that the most cataphatic of religions are typically those with the clearest laws regulating the distance of the subject and the thing, the greatest regulation of the whole, the restriction of the greatest regulation of well-being, the restriction of valid religious teaching to the sola scriptura in certain Protestant groups, or to the salaf of Islam, and the path referred to by its exonym of Wahhabism, constrain the understanding of God to certain delimited defiles. They also promulgate strict regulations in observance of this. This is especially true of their regulation of the feminine, no doubt due in large part to the preventing sexism of earlier ages. However, it also seems such regulations are an embodiment of the pleasure principle, precluding exposure of the signifier of the lack in the other that exposes the subject to the other jouissance beyond the law. Returning to Lacan's ethics, quote, desire disappears under pleasure's away, close quote, indicating that the subjectivization of desire requires an orientation towards the good and not the well-being. It is the pursuit of the good beyond all pleasurable service to goods elsewhere. For this reason, the subject, quote, cannot stand the extreme good that das Ding may bring it, close quote. The jouissance experienced in this case is not the phallic jouissance of the relation to the phallic object, but that related to the whole in the other, to the signifier of the lack in the other that the singularity of das Ding entails. The ethics of orthodoxy are centered on modes of being rather than on law or on particular goods. The orientation of the subject in Orthodox Christianity is toward God, understood in the context of his absence, with desire acting as a gravitation toward him beyond all goods of this world. This transcends the question of the good of the individual. Indeed, to the extent that a person seeks heaven because of its pleasurable qualities, that person moves away from the mode of being of relatedness and back toward atomism. In other words, moves back to an ethics of pleasure. Instead, in orthodoxy, the subject seeks in kenotic self-transcendence to push beyond the pleasure principle altogether, embodying death, being for death, to the extent the subject seeks something beyond life. It is not for nothing Christ warned, quote, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple, close quote. This willingness to take one's place among the dead, to be the between life and death, like Antigone, is clear in the lives of the saints. Saint Simeon, the fool in Christ, the prototype of the holy fool, is one such example. Simeon had made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem with his mother, quote, a very old woman about 80, close quote, for the feast of the exaltation of the cross. While there, he met a young man about 22 years old named John. John was on a pilgrimage with his parents and had married a girl that same year. Simeon and John became good friends and traveled away from Jerusalem together with their parents. On their way back, John pointed out to Simeon, quote, the monasteries all around the Holy Jordan. And on a sudden impulse, the two conspired to abscond from their parents and became monks. Quote, Simeon abandoned his old mother, John, his parents, and the young wife waiting for him at home. Close quote. The site of the monastery was a sign of something about which St. Simeon could not help but want to know more. John told Simeon that, quote, angels of God lived in the monasteries, and Simeon inquired whether they might see them. John's response was, quote, if we become like them, yes. Despite being endowed with much intellect, Simeon was confronted with a knowledge that could only be acquired as a matter of going through, an ascesis and purification at the cost of pleasure. This rather striking act, the abandonment of kith and kin, was not sanitized by St. Simeon's hagiographer, who made, quote, no attempt to gloss over the harshness and cruelty of what Simeon and John were doing to others and indeed to themselves. It is clear in the text, which notes that when they had arrived at the monastery, the superior did not stop encouraging them in their decision due to, quote, seeing the streams of tears pouring forth from their eyes, close quote. Lacan described religion as, at bottom, an attempt at recuperating the jouissance sacrificed in sublimation. He identified this operation as the distinguishing feature between, quote, religious work and, quote, an ethical form of catharsis. Lacan, following Aristotle, stated that catharsis pertained to the purification of desire. This purification being impossible, quote, unless one has at least established the crossing of its limits that we call fear and pity, close quote. If religious work is the operation of recuperating the jouissance lost in sublimation, then the question is ultimately one of sublimation contra catharsis. Sublimation, in Lacan's formulation here, can be found at the level of the object, the rising of the object to the dignity of the thing. Furthermore, quote, at the level of sublimation, the object is inseparable from imaginary and especially cultural elaborations, meaning that sublimation is connected not to the thing, but to that which takes its place. Thus, while religion, in Lacan's view, occupies itself with recuperation of jouissance sacrificed in sublimation, the religious work of St. Simeon is oriented towards not the elaborative systems that colonize the space of das Ding, but toward revealing precisely the ruptures of the real that das Ding brings with it. Indeed, St. Simeon pushed past the bounds of pity and fear in pursuit of the thing beyond all pleasurable limits. It is this movement beyond the pleasure principle that characterizes the Orthodox path. If this movement beyond pity and fear remains uncertain in the beginning of St. Simeon's story, the remainder of his hagiography illuminates the matter all the more. Commenting on St. Simeon, Jouissance describes how, quote, Christ does not destroy the law, but shows that the law is transcended in the kingdom. And St. Simeon is a citizen of the kingdom. In his person, he embodies transcendence of the law, the transgression which is a scandal only to those of us who still live in need of the law, in need of obedience, because we have not yet attained or know nothing about the end of the law, which is the freedom of the saints. Close quote. The end of the law, the recognition that finally there is no law and no other, appears as a scandal to those unprepared for this experiential knowledge. Jouissance then described how St. Simeon would intentionally cause moral scandal, such as when he entered, quote, the women's public baths, as it were, to the glory of God, close quote, that the morality of the Orthodox knows no ontological or deontological bounds is quite clearly visible in such acts by St. Simeon. The knowledge of good and evil is an experiential act and is predicated only on the relational or non-relational mode of existence of the hypostasis. Even so, the, quote, as it were to the glory of God, close quote, raises the valid question from a Lacanian perspective as to whether the Orthodox saint is not a sadist. The jouissance of the saint seems to be placed, after all, in the body of the other, which Lacan noted is, quote, ineliminable from the substance of the one who has said, I am what I am, close quote. Yet the God of de Sade, and Lacan insists he had one, is of course the materialist nature to whom the libertine appeals. It is because the materialist insists on pure immanence, on the whole world being the body of God, that, quote, the materialists are the only authentic believers, close quote. However, the sadist both relies on this collapse, i.e. relies on the natural order for jouissance, and yet also attempts to deny and countermand the other while all the while obeying the law. Despite the fact that the sadist cannot be carelessly conflated with the pervert, there seems to be a denial in the sadist of castration such that the sadist continues to view himself as the object of jouissance of the other nature. In other words, whereas in sublimation the object is raised to the dignity of the thing, in the perverse solution the subject takes the place of the thing. In discussing sublimation, Lacan suggested that art is related to hysteria and repression, religion to obsession and displacement, and science to paranoia and foreclosure. Art organizes around the emptiness of the thing. Religion avoids it, and science forecloses its very possibility. Perversion and the denial associated with it are not included in this discussion. In this way, the sadist is one who, outside of sublimation, takes upon oneself the place of the thing, who refuses to acknowledge, denies the lack in the other in the form of the symbolic phallus. The Orthodox saint is no sadist, then, precisely because the saint does not assume the place of the thing, even when provoking scandal. Furthermore, Lacan's equivocation of Verschenbung, which is repression, and the function of religion do little to square accounts with the profound apophatism of the East. It is not a matter of avoiding the thing through the ritualized do-gooding of Lacan's description of religion, nor is it related to the recuperation of what is lost in sublimation, namely, the fantasized real jouissance of the obsessive. Instead of an attempt to provoke the law, quote, Christ does not destroy the law. To obey the law, the Orthodox saint opens up to something beyond the law, to the other jouissance that is beyond, not before, the law. This again testifies to the existentially feminine position of the Eastern Church. There's a lot that's being glossed over here that's taken from previous chapters. I just wanted to give you a little bit of flavor. And plus, I haven't read this chapter yet. So, in de Casel's exposition, art and ethics share in common the fact that an individual traverses the law to produce something in which, quote, society can subsequently recognize itself. This allows one to see why the saints are the models of the church. They are the exceptions, not in the sense of categorical difference, but in the sense they are made of the same stuff, so to speak, as everyone else, and yet find it within themselves to step outside every manner of law, both secular, exemplified by the martyr, and sacred, exemplified by the fool. The saints, as pinnacles of Orthodox practice, serve as the center of ethics and aesthetics in the community or society of the Orthodox Church. Lacan posited one question with, quote, the force of a last judgment. Have you acted in conformity with the desire that is in you? Close quote. The desire within, the desire embodied in the absence of the thing, represented in repressed form of representative of the representation, is always, despite the vestments it dons in any given subject, the absence of the life each subject seeks in relationship. It is in relation to this desire that the Christian pursues through asceticism and the two paths of the church, marriage and monasticism, the transcendence of the self that occurs in the abandonment of idols, of God. The Christian embraces the death drive in pushing past the pleasure principle, abandoning the service of goods, and assumes instead, quote, an ethos of hopelessness and despair as far as concerns the life offered by personal survival, close quote. It is in relation to this desire that orthodoxy can announce a similar measure of the Last Judgment to Lacan's. Quote, it is not God's sentence, but his existence that judges humanity. Thanks for listening.